You do not look like someone who belongs on this street, so get off that bike before we make you. The words did not hit me all at once. They landed piece by piece, like gravel against glass, sharp and deliberate, each one meant to stick. I felt my hands tighten around the rubber grips of my handlebars, the faint warmth of the afternoon still trapped in them from the sun. The traffic light above me was green. Cars moved through the intersection like nothing had changed. But everything had. I slowed, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I understood the tone. I had heard it before. Not the exact sentence, not the exact voice, but the meaning behind it. Stop. You are not trusted here. I pressed my foot down onto the pavement, steadying the bike beneath me. The soft hiss of air escaping my tires as they settled against the asphalt sounded louder than it should have. Or maybe everything else had gone quiet. I could feel eyes. Not just theirs, but the ones behind windshields, behind storefront glass, behind the thin invisible line that separates people who watch from people who are watched. I lifted my head slowly. 3 officers. 2 by the patrol car, 1 already stepping closer. Their uniforms were clean, pressed, every line sharp, every badge catching the light just enough to remind you what it stood for. Authority. Control. Assumption. My heartbeat did not spike the way it used to. It slowed instead, heavy and measured, like something inside me had learned that panic only makes things worse. Still, there was a familiar weight in my chest, something old, something I had carried long before this moment. I swung my leg over the bike and stood upright, keeping my hands visible, fingers relaxed at my sides. I did not want to give them a reason. Not even a small one. The officer closest to me, tall, pale, his jaw set like he had already decided how this would go, looked me up and down in a way that was not about safety. It was about judgment. I could feel it travel from my shoes to my face, pausing just long enough to make sure I noticed. "We got a report," he said, his voice flat, controlled, rehearsed. But there was something underneath it, something less official, something personal. I let the words hang there for a second. A report? That word always came before something else. Before questions that were not really questions. Before decisions that were already made. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint smell of hot pavement and distant gasoline. Somewhere down the block, a car horn blared, impatient, disconnected from this small, frozen pocket of tension. I swallowed slowly, keeping my voice even when I spoke. "What report?" The question was simple. It was fair. But I could see it land wrong. Not because it was disrespectful, but because it was not submission. The officer's eyes narrowed just slightly, like I had stepped outside of a script he expected me to follow. Behind him, one of the others shifted his stance, his hand resting near his belt, not touching anything, but close enough to remind me that he could. That they could. I felt the air press against my skin, heavier now, like the space around us had thickened. This was the moment. The one where things could tilt in either direction. The one where a misunderstanding could become something else entirely. My fingers curled slightly, not into fists, just enough to ground myself, to remind my body where I was. The street. The bike. The sun still warm on the back of my neck. I was not invisible. Even if they wanted me to be something else. Even if they had already decided what they saw. I took a slow breath in through my nose, steady, controlled, the way I had learned a long time ago in a place far from here, where pressure felt different but no less real. I did not move forward. I did not step back. I stayed exactly where I was, holding the space between who they thought I was and who I knew I was, waiting to see which version would speak louder. The word report lingered in the air between us, stretching longer than it should have, like it was waiting for me to accept it without question, but I did not move, not yet, because I had learned that sometimes the smallest movement can be misunderstood when people are already looking at you through a lens you did not choose, and I could feel that lens on me now, heavy and unblinking, like it had already made up its mind, so I stayed still, letting my breath settle into a slow rhythm, counting it the way I used to when the world around me got too loud, even when no one else could hear it, and through my nose, out through my mouth, steady, controlled, present, because losing control was never an option, not here, not now, not ever again. And I could see the officer watching me, not just waiting, but measuring, like my silence was giving him more to work with than my words ever could. And behind him the patrol car idled with a low hum, its engine vibrating faintly through the ground beneath my feet, a reminder that this moment was not just happening in my head, it was real, it was here, and it could go in directions I had seen too many times before, directions that never ended well for people who looked like me, people who had done nothing more than exist in the wrong place at the wrong time under the wrong assumptions, and I refused to let that be the story this time. Not because I thought I could control them, but because I could control myself. And that had to be enough, it had to be. The officer took another step closer, close enough now that I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the kind that come from years of squinting into situations you think you understand, even when you do not, and his voice came again, firmer this time, like he was trying to close the space between us with authority alone, saying there had been a call about someone matching my description. Riding through the area, possibly checking properties, possibly looking for something that did not belong to them. And the way he said possibly told me everything I needed to know, because possibly means uncertainty, and uncertainty should mean caution, but it rarely does when the person in front of you looks like a conclusion, and I felt something shift inside my chest, not anger, not fear, something steadier than both, something rooted deeper. Something that had been built over years of being underestimated, overlooked, misread. I let my gaze meet his. Not challenging, not defiant, just present, just there, because I was not going to shrink to make this easier for him, and I spoke again, keeping my tone level, keeping every word deliberate, asking what exactly I had done to justify being stopped, and for a second, just a second, I saw it, the flicker, the moment where the script faltered, where the certainty he carried did not quite line up with the question I asked, and it was small, almost invisible, but it was there, and I held on to that. Because moments like that matter, they are cracks, and cracks are where truth starts to get in. The breeze shifted again, brushing against my arms, cooling the heat that had been building under my skin, and somewhere behind me a door opened and closed, life continuing just a few feet away from this suspended moment, and I wondered briefly if anyone understood how thin the line was between ordinary and something else. How quickly a simple bike ride home could turn into a test of who you are allowed to be in your own city, on your own street, under your own sky. The officer exhaled slowly, like he was recalibrating. Like he was deciding how to proceed now that I had not given him what he expected, and I could see his shoulders shift, not relaxing, but adjusting, and the others mirrored it in subtle ways, small movements that spoke louder than words, and I felt it then, that quiet, familiar awareness settling into my body, the one that told me this was no longer just about answering questions, this was about holding my ground without escalating, about existing in a space that did not feel built for me and refusing to disappear anyway. And I stayed there, feet planted on the pavement, hands still visible, breath still steady, carrying the weight of every moment that had taught me how to stand exactly like this, right here, right now, without breaking. The silence stretched just a second longer than expected, and in that space I could feel the balance shifting, not outwardly, not in a way anyone watching would notice, but internally, where decisions are made before they are spoken, and I saw it in his eyes again, that brief hesitation, like something was not aligning the way it should, like the version of me he had prepared for was not matching the one standing in front of him. And that mismatch made people uncomfortable, it always had. Because it meant they might have to reconsider, and reconsidering takes effort, it takes humility, and those are not things authority reaches for easily. The officer cleared his throat slightly, his posture tightening as if to reclaim control of the moment, and he asked for identification, his tone firm but no longer as certain as before, and I nodded slowly, not out of obedience, but because I understood the rhythm of this exchange, the steps people expect you to follow so they can feel justified in what they are doing, and I reached carefully, deliberately, toward the small pouch attached to the side of my bike, making sure every movement was visible, every motion predictable, because unpredictability in a moment like this can be misunderstood in ways that are hard to undo. My fingers brushed against the worn fabric of the pouch, and for a brief second I felt the familiar texture ground me, reminding me that this was still my life, my body, my space, even if it did not feel like it right now. I pulled out my wallet slowly and held it up just enough for him to see, not handing it over yet, just making it clear that I was cooperating without surrendering myself completely to the assumptions being placed on me. The officer reached out and took it, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment, and even that contact felt loaded, like it carried more meaning than it should have. He stepped back slightly as he opened it, scanning the contents, and I watched his eyes move, left to right, pausing on my name, my address. The small details that make up a person on paper, details that often matter more to people than the living, breathing humans standing in front of them, and I wondered what he saw when he read it, if it changed anything at all, or if it simply confirmed whatever he had already decided. Behind him the other officers remained in place, their presence steady, watchful, like a wall that did not need to move to make itself known, and I could feel the weight of their attention just as much as his, pressing in from all sides, narrowing the space around me without ever touching me. I shifted my weight slightly, the sole of my shoe scraping softly against the pavement, and that small sound seemed louder than it should have, like everything in this moment was amplified, every breath, every glance, every second stretching longer than it should. And as I stood there waiting, I felt something else rise to the surface, not from this moment, but from others, older ones, moments where I had been told to stay quiet, to comply, to not make things worse, to be smaller so the situation would pass. And I understood the logic behind that, I always had, but I also knew what it cost, because every time you shrink yourself to fit someone else's expectation, you lose a piece of something you cannot easily get back, and I had spent too many years learning how to rebuild that, piece by piece, breath by breath, until I could stand like this, in the middle of a street, under the weight of someone else's doubt, and still feel whole, still feel present, still feel like myself. The officer looked up from my identification then, his gaze meeting mine again, and there was a difference now, subtle but real, like the certainty had been replaced with something more complicated. Something less comfortable, and I held that gaze, not to challenge him. Not to prove anything, but simply because I existed, because I was here, because I deserved to be seen as more than a possibility on a report, and in that quiet exchange, without words, I could feel the moment shifting again, not resolved, not yet, but moving, inch by inch, towards something that neither of us had fully expected when this began. I saw the moment land in him before he said anything, the slight pause after looking at my identification, the way his fingers lingered just a second too long on the edge of the card like it held more weight than plastic should, and when he spoke again his voice had changed, not softer, not kinder, just less certain. Like the ground beneath his assumptions had shifted and he had not decided yet whether to adjust or double down. And that uncertainty settled into the space between us, thick and quiet. He asked where I was coming from, and the question itself was ordinary, but the way it was asked carried something else, something that suggested my answer would not just be information, it would be a test, and I felt that familiar awareness rise again. The one that measures every word before it leaves your mouth because you know it might be used to shape the outcome. I told him I was coming home from work, keeping my tone even, keeping my posture steady, not offering more than what was asked, not because I had something to hide, but because I understood how easily extra details can be twisted into something they were never meant to be. He nodded slowly, like he was processing, like he was trying to fit my answer into a narrative that no longer made complete sense. And I could see it in his eyes, that quiet recalculation, the part of him that was searching for alignment between the report he mentioned and the person standing in front of him, and for a moment I wondered what that report had actually said, what description had been given, what details had been enough to bring 3 officers to stop one person on a bike in the middle of an ordinary street, and whether any of those details truly pointed to me or if they had simply pointed to something broader, something easier. Something that did not require precision to act on. The breeze picked up again, brushing against the loose strands of my hair, carrying with it the distant sound of a siren far off in another part of the city, a reminder that life was still moving beyond this moment, that somewhere else something else was happening, something that might actually need attention, and yet here we were, suspended in this quiet standoff built on uncertainty and perception, I shifted my shoulders slightly, easing the tension that had settled there, and I felt the weight of my backpack press against my back, a small, grounding pressure that reminded me of the hours before this, the routine of my day, the normalcy that had been interrupted, and I held on to that, because it mattered. It reminded me that I was not defined by this moment, even if it felt like it right now. The officer handed my identification back, but his grip did not fully release it at first, like he was hesitating. Like he was deciding whether to say something else, and I could feel the question forming. Before it came, the kind of question that is not really a question, the kind that is meant to probe, to test, to see if you will slip, and when he finally spoke, he asked if I had anything on me he should know about. And there it was, the shift from uncertainty back toward suspicion, subtle but unmistakable, and I felt that steady part of me tighten just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition, because I had seen this pattern before, the way a situation can move forward even when the original reason starts to fall apart, and I took a slow breath, letting it settle before I answered, making sure my voice stayed calm, clear, unshaken. I told him no, because there was nothing else to say, nothing else to offer, and for a second the silence returned, heavier this time, like it was carrying the weight of what had not been found, what had not been confirmed, what had not matched the expectation, and I could see the others watching more closely now, their attention sharpening, their bodies still but ready, like they were waiting for the next move, not just from me, but from him. And I understood then that this moment was no longer just about me being stopped, it was about what he would choose to do. With the doubt that had crept into his certainty, whether he would acknowledge it or push past it, and I stood there, steady, grounded, refusing to fill the silence with anything unnecessary, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a moment like this is simply not give them anything they can turn against you, and as the seconds stretched, I felt something else settle into place inside me, something quiet but firm. The understanding that no matter how this ended, I had already held on to something important, I had stayed present, I had stayed myself, and that, in a situation built to make you feel otherwise, mattered more than anything they could take or question in that moment. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, like something tightening just beneath the surface, and I felt it before I saw it, the subtle change in posture, the way the officer squared his shoulders again as if uncertainty had become something he needed to correct rather than consider, and when he spoke this time his voice carried a sharper edge, not loud, not aggressive, but firmer, like he was reclaiming ground he thought he had lost. And he told me to step away from the bike, just a little, just enough to create distance, and I understood what that meant without him needing to explain it. I understood the implication, the direction this could go, and I felt a familiar weight settle into my chest, not panic, not fear, but pressure, the kind that builds when a situation starts moving beyond logic and into something less predictable. I did not move right away, not because I was refusing, but because I was choosing how to respond. Choosing how to hold myself in a moment that was no longer neutral, and I could feel their attention sharpen instantly, all three of them watching for that decision, for that movement, for anything they could interpret, and I knew then that every inch mattered, every second mattered, so I stepped back slowly, deliberately, keeping my hands visible, keeping my movements controlled, not giving them anything sudden, anything that could be mistaken for something it was not, and as I moved, I felt the ground beneath my feet more clearly, the solidness of it, the reality of where I stood. Because grounding yourself in a moment like this is the only way to keep it from slipping away from you. The officer nodded slightly, like my compliance confirmed something for him, but it did not relax the tension, it redirected it, and he took a step closer to the bike, his eyes scanning it briefly, like it held answers that I did not, and I watched him, not with suspicion, not with challenge, just with awareness. Because awareness is what keeps you present, and presence is what keeps you steady, and I could feel the air shift again, heavier now, like the moment had crossed into something more defined, something that was no longer just about a report, but about control, about authority being asserted even when the reason behind it had grown thin, and I felt my breath deepen, slow, steady, the way it had been trained to do under pressure. the way it had learned to anchor itself when everything else around it felt uncertain, and I held onto that rhythm, letting it guide me instead of the tension, instead of the weight of their presence pressing in from all sides. The officer asked again, this time not a question but a statement, telling me to keep my hands where he could see them, and I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but out of recognition. Because my hands had never left that position, because I had been careful from the very beginning, careful in ways that people who never have to think about these moments do not understand, and still, it was not enough. It is never enough when the assumption is already in place, and I felt that truth settle into me again, not as frustration, but as clarity. Because clarity keeps you from reacting in ways that will only make things worse, and I nodded once, acknowledging the instruction even though I was already following it. Because sometimes acknowledgement is not about agreement, it is about maintaining the balance of the situation, and I could see the other officers shift slightly again, their stance adjusting, their focus tightening, like they were preparing for something that had not happened, something they expected might, and that expectation hung in the air like a shadow, shaping everything around it. And I realized then how thin the line was that I was standing on, how easily this could tilt if I let anything slip, if I let frustration show, if I let the weight of the moment pull me off center, and I refused to let that happen, not here, not now, so I stayed exactly where I was, steady, grounded, breathing slow, eyes forward, holding on to every part of myself that I had worked so hard to build, because in a moment where everything around you is trying to define you, the only thing you can truly control is how firmly you remain who you are, and I held that line, quiet, unshaken, even as the pressure around me continued to rise. The pressure did not explode, it settled, heavy and constant, like a weight pressing down on every breath, and I felt it most in the stillness, in the space where nothing was happening but everything was being decided, the kind of moment where time stretches just enough for you to hear your own heartbeat, slow and deliberate, each pulse a reminder to stay present, to stay grounded. To not let the tension pull you into something you cannot take back, and I kept my eyes forward, not locked onto any one of them, but aware of all of them, the way their positions formed a quiet perimeter, the way their attention never drifted, and I realized that this was no longer about what I had done, or not done, it was about what they believed could happen next, and that belief was shaping everything. The officer nearest my bike circled it slowly, not touching, just observing, like the object itself might confirm something they had not yet proven, and I watched without reacting, because reacting would give the moment more energy than it needed, and energy in a situation like this can shift things in ways you cannot control. So I stayed still, letting the quiet do the work. Letting the absence of escalation speak louder than any defense I could offer. The sun had begun to dip slightly, casting longer shadows across the street, stretching everything just a little thinner, a little sharper, and I could see those shadows cutting across the pavement between us, dividing the space in subtle ways, and it struck me how something so ordinary could feel so significant when everything else was suspended. When every detail became part of the moment, the officer who had been speaking to me stepped closer again, his presence filling the space in front of me, and his voice came lower this time, not louder, but more controlled, more deliberate, like he was choosing each word carefully, and he told me to stay where I was, to not make any sudden movements, and I nodded once, slow, steady, not because I was being instructed, but because I was choosing to maintain the balance that had kept this from tipping over. And as I nodded, I felt something shift inside me. Something deeper than the surface tension, something older, and for a brief second the street around me faded, not completely, but enough for another place to rise in its place, a place where stillness meant survival, where control was not just a choice but a necessity, where every movement was measured and every breath was intentional, and I could almost hear it, the cadence of instruction, the rhythm of discipline. The quiet expectation that you hold yourself together no matter what is happening around you, and I held on to that, letting it anchor me here, in this moment, in this street, in this version of pressure that looked different but felt just as real. My shoulders settled slightly, not dropping, not relaxing, just aligning, the way they had been trained to do when the body needed to stabilize itself without drawing attention, and my breathing matched that alignment, steady, controlled, unshaken, and I could feel the difference it made, not just inside me, but in the space around me, because presence has a way of influencing a moment even when no one acknowledges it. The officer hesitated again, just a fraction, but enough for me to notice, and I realized then that he was watching not just what I did, but how I held myself, how I existed in this space. And that observation was beginning to challenge something in him. Something that did not quite fit with the expectation he had walked into this situation with. And I did not push that, I did not try to force it, I simply remained steady, grounded, letting the reality of who I was stand on its own without explanation, without defense. Because sometimes the strongest statement you can make is the one you do not have to say, and as the moment continued to stretch, as the air remained thick and quiet and full of unspoken decisions, I felt a calm settle deeper into my chest, not the absence of tension, but the mastery of it, the ability to stand in it without letting it take control, and I stayed there, centered, aware, holding that line with quiet strength, waiting for the moment to reveal what it would become next. I did not move, not because I was frozen, but because I understood that movement was not what this moment needed, and as I stood there, steady and aligned, I felt the shift before it showed, the kind of shift that happens when perception begins to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, in the small details people do not realize they are revealing. The officer in front of me exhaled slowly. And this time it was different, not controlled, not measured but real, like something inside him had loosened just enough to let uncertainty breathe, and his eyes moved again, not scanning for threat, but searching for understanding, and that difference, as small as it seemed, changed the weight of the moment. I could feel it, the tension no longer tightening in one direction, but dispersing, thinning, like the air after a storm begins to pass, and he glanced briefly at the others, a quick exchange that did not need words. And I saw it there too, the same hesitation, the same quiet recalibration, like the certainty they had built their stance on was no longer holding as firmly as before, and for the first time since this began, I felt the space around me widen just slightly, not physically, but in possibility, in outcome, in what this moment could become, and I remained exactly as I was, not stepping into that space, not pushing it, just allowing it to exist. Because forcing a shift too quickly can close it just as fast, and I had learned that patience in moments like this is not weakness, it is control. The officer looked back at me, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something closer to a question than a command, and he asked where I learned to stay so calm, and for a second the street seemed to still even further, like the question itself had weight, like it had crossed a line from assumption into curiosity, and I felt something inside me settle even deeper. Because that question was not about suspicion, it was about recognition, and I answered without hesitation, without performance, just truth. I told him I had been trained to stay calm under pressure, that it was something I learned a long time ago, in a place where losing control could cost more than just a misunderstanding, and as the words left my mouth, I saw it land, not dramatically, not like a revelation in a story, but quietly. Like a piece of information that does not fit the narrative someone has been holding, and he blinked once, slowly, like he was processing, like he was replaying everything that had happened in the last few minutes through a different lens, and I could almost feel the shift happening inside him, the realization that the person he had stopped was not who he thought she was, not in the way he had defined her, and the air between us changed again, lighter now, not free of tension, but no longer weighed down by the same certainty. And one of the other officers shifted his stance, his shoulders easing just slightly. Like the need to hold that rigid line had begun to fade, and I stood there, still grounded, still present, but no longer carrying the same pressure, because the moment had turned, not because I forced it, not because I argued or resisted, but because I remained, because I held my ground in a way that allowed them to see something different, something they had not expected, and as the officer looked at me again, really looked this time, I could see it in his eyes, the recognition, the understanding that had not been there before, and it did not come with apology, not yet, but it came with something just as important, a pause, a reconsideration. A step back from the assumption that had started all of this, and in that quiet shift, I felt the balance of the moment finally begin to settle into something new, something that no longer felt like it was about control, but about clarity, and I stayed there, steady and unshaken, letting that clarity take its place without needing to claim it, without needing to prove anything further, because sometimes the most powerful turning point is the one that happens in silence, where nothing dramatic is said, but everything important is understood. The moment did not end with a loud realization or a sudden change, it softened, like tension slowly releasing from a space that had been held too tightly for too long, and I saw it in the way the officer stepped back, not dramatically, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, a small shift of weight that carried more meaning than any apology could have in that instant, and when he looked at me again, his gaze was different. No longer searching for something to confirm, but recognizing something that had already been there, and he handed my identification back fully this time, his grip releasing without hesitation, without that lingering uncertainty from before, and I took it calmly, my fingers steady as they closed around the familiar edges, grounding myself once more in something that belonged to me, something that had never changed even when the moment around it had, and the air between us felt lighter now, not empty. Not resolved completely, but no longer pressing in the same way. And I noticed how the other officers had eased as well, their posture no longer rigid, their attention no longer fixed on anticipation, but on observation, like they were witnessing this shift just as much as they had participated in the tension before it, and for a brief second, no one spoke, the street returning to its quiet rhythm around us, cars passing at a distance, a faint breeze moving through the space, carrying with it the subtle sounds of a city continuing on, unaffected by the small, intense moment that had just unfolded in its midst, and I felt my shoulders settle just slightly, not in relief, but in alignment, the kind that comes when your body recognizes that the immediate pressure has passed, and the officer cleared his throat softly, the sound almost lost in the open air. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer commanding, no longer probing, but measured in a different way, as if he was choosing his words with a new awareness. And he said that they had received a call that led them here, that they had to follow up on it, and the explanation was simple, almost routine, but it carried an undertone now, something closer to justification than authority, and I listened without interrupting, not because I needed the explanation, but because I understood what it represented, a shift from assumption to accountability, however small, however incomplete, and I nodded once, acknowledging his words, not agreeing, not dismissing, just recognizing that the moment had moved into a different space, one where understanding could exist alongside what had already happened, and he paused again, just a fraction, like there was something else he could say but was not sure how to, and I did not fill that silence for him, I let it remain. Because some things are not meant to be forced into words, some realizations need that space to settle on their own, and in that quiet, I felt something steady inside me, something that had not been shaken by the tension, something that had held firm from the beginning to now, and I realized that this was the part people rarely see, the part where nothing dramatic happens, where there is no clear victory, no loud resolution, just a shift, a recognition, a moment where something changes quietly but meaningfully. And I placed my identification back into my pouch with slow, deliberate movement, the same care I had carried through every second of this encounter, not because I was still under pressure, but because that control had become part of me, part of how I moved through moments like this, and I reached for my bike, my hand resting lightly on the handlebar, feeling its familiar shape beneath my palm, and I waited, just one more second, not for permission, but for clarity, and when it was there, when the space no longer held that same tension, I stepped forward slightly, re-entering the flow of my own path, and I could feel their eyes still on me, but it was different now, not the weight of suspicion, but the presence of awareness, and as I began to move again, slow and steady, I carried that shift with me, not as something I had won, but as something that had been revealed, something that had always been there beneath the surface, waiting to be seen, and I did not look back, because I did not need to, the moment had already said everything it needed to say, not in words, but in the quiet understanding that remained long after the tension had faded. I pushed the bike forward and the wheels began to turn again, slow at first, the soft clicking of the chain settling back into its natural rhythm, and with each inch I moved away from them, the weight of the moment shifted behind me, not disappearing, not forgotten, but no longer pressing against my chest the way it had just minutes before, and I could still feel it, the echo of it. Like a distant vibration beneath the surface of something steady, something grounded, and I kept my pace even. Not rushing, not lingering, just moving forward the way I had intended to before everything had been interrupted. The street stretched ahead of me in the same way it always had, familiar, ordinary, untouched by what had just unfolded, and yet I knew something had changed, not in the street, not in the city, but in the quiet space inside me where moments like this leave their mark, and I let the air fill my lungs fully this time. Deeper than before, not controlled out of necessity, but natural. Again, like my body was remembering what it felt like to exist without being measured, without being questioned, and I thought about how easily this could have gone another way, how thin that line had been from the very first second, a line shaped not by what I had done, but by what was assumed, by what was projected onto me before I ever spoke a word, and I understood something clearly in that moment. Something that had been building through every second of that encounter, that the hardest part of standing in a situation like that is not the pressure itself, it is holding on to who you are while that pressure tries to redefine you, tries to compress you into something smaller, something simpler, something easier for others to understand without actually seeing you, and I kept moving, the bike steady beneath me, the pavement rolling out in front of my tires. And I let that understanding settle, not as anger, not as frustration, but as truth, a quiet, grounded truth that did not need to be spoken to be real, and I realized that strength is not always loud, it is not always visible in the ways people expect, sometimes it is in the restraint, in the control, in the decision to remain steady when everything around you is trying to pull you off balance, and that kind of strength does not come from a single moment, it is built over time, through experiences, through discipline, through learning how to stand in discomfort, without letting it define you. And I thought about the way the officer had looked at me at the end, not with certainty, not with assumption, but with something closer to recognition, and while it did not erase what had happened, it mattered because recognition is where change begins, even if it is small, even if it is slow, and I understood that moments like this are not just about what happens on the surface. They are about what shifts underneath, in the way people see, in the way they question their own assumptions, and I hoped, quietly, that something in that moment would stay with him, the same way it would stay with me, not as a conflict, but as a lesson, a reminder that what you think you see is not always the full truth, that people carry more than what is visible in a single glance. And as I rode further down the street, the distance growing between me and that intersection, I felt the last of the tension leave my shoulders, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, a sense of clarity that did not need validation from anyone else. And I understood then that no matter how many times moments like this happen, no matter how often you are placed in a position where you have to prove your worth, your right to exist freely, the most important thing you can hold on to is your own sense of self, because that is the one thing no one else gets to define unless you let them. And I kept riding, the rhythm of the wheels steady, the wind brushing lightly against my skin, carrying with it the quiet reminder that forward is always possible, that even after a moment designed to stop you, to question you, to reduce you, you can still move. Still continue, still remain whole, and that, more than anything else, is where real strength lives, not in the moment itself, but in what you carry beyond it, in the way you choose to keep going without letting it take something from you that you cannot get back.